A man died in 1994, and we're still arguing about whether he was a genius or a drunk who got lucky. Charles Bukowski wrote thousands of poems and 6 novels, most of them about drinking, fighting, gambling, and sleeping with women he barely knew. He became one of the most influential writers of the 20th century without ever pretending to be respectable. That contradiction is where his story really begins. August 16th, 1920, Andernach, Germany. A child is born to an American soldier and a German woman. The father, Heinrich Bukowski, had stayed in Germany after World War I ended, serving in the occupation forces. The mother, Katharina Fett, was the sister of one of his friends. They'd had an affair. She got pregnant. Records show they married a month before the birth, though Bukowski himself would later claim he was a bastard. Maybe he preferred that version. Maybe it felt truer to how he saw himself. The child was named Heinrich Karl Bukowski. He wouldn't be called Charles for years. That name came later, along with everything else that made him who he became. Germany in 1920 was collapsing. The war reparations demanded by the Treaty of Versailles had destroyed the economy. Inflation was spiraling into madness. Heinrich Sr. couldn't find work, couldn't feed his family, couldn't see a future. So he made a decision that would shape his son's entire life. They would go to America. On April 18th, 1923, the family boarded a ship in Bremerhaven. Destination, Baltimore, Maryland. The child was not yet 3 years old. He spoke only German. The ocean crossing took weeks. Then America appeared on the horizon, vast and foreign and supposedly full of opportunity. What happened next wasn't opportunity. It was transformation through violence. The family arrived in Baltimore and immediately began erasing their German identity. Heinrich became Henry, Katharina became Kate, and the child, Heinrich Karl, became Henry too. The pronunciation of their last name changed from Bukowski to Bukowski. Sound more American, blend in, forget where you came from. But the neighborhood children didn't forget. They heard the accent. They saw the clothes his parents made him wear. They called him Heini, the German diminutive of Heinrich. They mocked him. He learned English, but he learned something else first. He learned that being different meant being a target. After saving money in Baltimore, the family moved west to Los Angeles, where Henry Sr.'s parents lived in Pasadena. His grandfather, Leonard, had emigrated from Germany decades earlier and built a successful carpentry business. Leonard had made it. Henry Sr. had not, and that failure ate at him. The Los Angeles of the 1920s wasn't the sprawling metropolis it would become. It was still growing, still raw, full of people who'd come west looking for something better. The Bukowski family settled into a house in a modest neighborhood. Henry Sr. looked for work. Often he couldn't find it. The Depression was coming, and even before it arrived, jobs were scarce for a man with limited skills and a temper. That temper found an outlet. His son. Young Henry was beaten regularly, not occasionally, not as punishment for specific infractions, regularly, systematically. With a razor strop, the leather strap used to sharpen straight razors, the father would inspect the lawn. If the grass wasn't cut perfectly, if a single blade stood too high, the beating came. He would inspect the boy's room. If anything was out of place, the beating came. He would inspect the boy himself, looking for reasons. This wasn't discipline. This was rage finding a convenient target. The father couldn't control the economy or his own failures, but he could control this small body. So he did. The beatings continued through the boy's childhood and into his teens. They were thorough. They were brutal. They were formative. Everything Bukowski would later write about authority, about power, about men who use violence because they have nothing else, came from those beatings. The razor strop appears again and again in his work, especially in Ham on Rye, the semi-autobiographical novel that documents this period with clinical precision. But the violence at home was just one source of pain. The other arrived when he hit puberty. Around age 13, Bukowski developed acne, not the mild teenage breakouts most kids endure. Acne vulgaris, the doctors at Los Angeles County Hospital called it. Huge boils erupted across his face and body. They were painful. They were grotesque. They made him look like something other than human. He missed the entire first semester of high school undergoing treatments at the hospital. The procedures were primitive and left his face heavily scarred. When he returned to school, the damage was permanent. The other students stared. Some laughed. Most just avoided him. He was a freak now, marked and isolated. The combination of the violent father and the destroyed face created something. Not just loneliness, not just pain, a specific kind of awareness. The world was brutal. People were cruel. Beauty was a lie used to make the ugly feel worse. Authority was violence dressed up as order. And there was no rescue coming. Most teenagers who learn these lessons become bitter or broken. Some kill themselves. A few find ways to transform the pain into something else. Bukowski found two. The first was alcohol. A friend named William Baldy Mullinax, son of an alcoholic surgeon, introduced him to drinking. That first experience was an epiphany. Later, Bukowski would write, "This is going to help me for a very long time." He recognized immediately that alcohol wasn't just numbing the pain, it was providing access to a different way of experiencing reality, a way where the ugliness mattered less, where the violence could be observed from a distance, where he could function. The second discovery was literature. During high school, he started visiting the public library, not for school assignments, for himself. He read voraciously, looking for writers who told the truth, who didn't prettify existence, who acknowledged that life was often ugly and painful and absurd. He found Hemingway's early stories and loved their stripped-down prose. He discovered the Russian writers, especially Turgenev, and responded to their unflinching examination of human nature. But most writers bored him. They wrote about things he couldn't relate to. They used beautiful language to describe beautiful people doing beautiful things. It felt like a lie. Then he found John Fante. Fante was a Los Angeles writer, the son of Italian immigrants, writing about poverty and failure, and the desperate scramble to survive. His novel, Ask the Dust, captured a Los Angeles Bukowski recognized. Not the Hollywood version, the real city, the cheap rooms and failed dreams and people hanging on by their fingernails. Fante's writing had something Bukowski hadn't found elsewhere: energy, passion, a rhythm that felt alive. Reading Fante, Bukowski thought, I could do this. Not exactly like this, but something like this, writing about the world as I actually see it. It was the beginning of an ambition that would take decades to fulfill. But first, there were obstacles. There was always something in the way. In 1939, Bukowski graduated high school and enrolled at Los Angeles City College to study journalism. The idea was practical. Journalists got paid to write. It seemed like a path, but he couldn't make himself care about the assignments or the classes. After 2 years of poor grades and waning interest, he dropped out in 1941. The timing was significant. America had just entered World War II. Most young men his age were being drafted. Bukowski was classified 4F, exempted from military service for psychological reasons. The official records don't specify what those reasons were. Probably the combination of his appearance, his social awkwardness, and whatever the examining doctors sensed during the evaluation. He wasn't soldier material, so while other men went to war, Bukowski started his real education. He left his parents' house for good. His father had discovered some of his early writing attempts and gone berserk, destroying everything and throwing his possessions onto that perfectly manicured lawn. Bukowski walked away. He was 21 years old and had nothing except a certainty that he was a writer, even if nobody would publish him. The next few years were nomadic. He worked menial jobs: stock boy, dishwasher, elevator operator, Red Cross orderly. He moved from city to city, renting cheap rooms, drinking heavily, and writing. The writing was everything. He sent stories to magazines and collected rejection slips. He kept writing anyway. In 1944, something broke through. A story called Aftermath of a Lengthy Rejection Slip was published in Story magazine. It was his first real publication, and it felt like validation. 2 years later, another story, 20 Tanks from Castledown appeared in Portfolio 3, published by Black Sun Press. The issue also featured work by Henry Miller, Jean Genet, and Jean-Paul Sartre. Bukowski was in serious company. For a moment, it seemed like a literary career might actually be possible. But that moment didn't last. The publications didn't lead anywhere. The magazines that had accepted his work folded or stopped responding to submissions. The breakthrough he'd hoped for didn't materialize. And Bukowski, frustrated and disillusioned, made a decision that would define the next decade of his life. He stopped writing completely for almost 10 years. He called this period his 10-year drunk, and the name was accurate. He drank constantly, worked sporadically, and lived in a blur of cheap rooms and cheaper bars. The writing ambition didn't disappear. It went underground. It festered. But he wasn't putting words on paper. He was living the life that would later become the material. During part of this period, he worked at a pickle factory. He also spent time roaming around the country, taking whatever work he could find, staying in rooming houses where the walls were thin and the neighbours were desperate. He met people who would later appear in his fiction, thinly disguised. He experienced things that would become stories, but at the time, he wasn't thinking about any of that. He was just surviving. Then in the early 1950s, he took a job with the United States Post Office in Los Angeles, first as a fill-in letter carrier. It was brutal work, walking miles every day, carrying heavy bags of mail, dealing with dogs and weather, and the relentless pressure to move faster. He lasted almost 3 years before quitting, but the post office would call him back. It always did. It was steady employment, which meant it was a trap, but it was also the kind of soul-crushing experience that eventually produces either madness or art. For Bukowski, it would produce both. Before he returned to the post office permanently, something happened that almost killed him. In 1954, Bukowski began hemorrhaging internally. A bleeding ulcer, the result of years of heavy drinking and poor diet. He was rushed to Los Angeles County Hospital and spent 9 days there, barely alive. The doctors told him he'd die if he kept drinking. He nodded. He understood. The day he left the hospital, he bought a bottle and got drunk. Later, he would say he never regretted that decision. The drinking was part of who he was. Without it, he might live longer, but he wouldn't be himself. And being himself mattered more than longevity. What changed after the hospitalization wasn't his drinking. It was his writing. Lying in that hospital bed, feeling death circling close, something shifted. The 10-year drunk was over. He started writing again. Not fiction this time, poetry. The poems were different from the stories he'd written in the 1940s. They were rougher, more direct, less concerned with literary convention. They documented his life exactly as it was. The hangovers, the failed relationships, the crushing boredom of work, the small moments of beauty that appeared unexpectedly, like flowers growing through concrete. He wrote about drinking and sex and gambling on horses, and the particular loneliness of cheap rooms at 3 a.m. Small magazines started publishing the poems. Gallows, a tiny poetry journal, took some. Nomad, an avant-garde literary magazine, published 2 of his poems in their inaugural 1959 issue. These weren't prestigious publications. They didn't pay, but they were something. Proof that someone out there recognized what he was doing. And slowly, very slowly, Charles Bukowski began building the foundation of a literary career that would eventually reach millions of readers. But that success was still years away. First, there would be more suffering, more dead-end jobs, more destructive relationships, more nights wondering if any of this mattered at all. The post office was waiting. And this time, when he walked back through those doors in 1960, he would stay for more than a decade, trapped in a system designed to break people down into interchangeable parts. The experience would destroy him and remake him. It would give him the material for his first novel and established the voice that would define everything he wrote afterward. The post office in 1960 was different from his first stint. He wasn't carrying mail anymore. He was a letter filing clerk, which sounds cleaner but was somehow worse. Night shift. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Mountains of envelopes that needed to be sorted by hand, stuffed into slots, organised by zip code and route. Hour after hour. The same mechanical motion. His back ached. His shoulders burned. The supervisors walked the floor, yelling at anyone who slowed down. Most of his co-workers were black men. The white clerks worked days. Bukowski chose nights deliberately. Fewer people, less supervision, more time to think, which was both blessing and curse. He'd show up drunk sometimes, hungover most of the time. The other clerks talked about sports and women. Bukowski kept to himself, occasionally mentioning he was a writer. Nobody believed him. Why would they? He looked like every other guy shuffling envelopes in a government building at 2 a.m. Scarred face, rumpled clothes, smelling like yesterday's whiskey. Nothing about him suggested literary ambition. Nothing suggested any ambition at all beyond getting through the shift and finding a bar that was still open. But something had changed after the hospital. The writing was back, and this time it wasn't going to stop. During breaks, he'd scribble poems on scraps of paper. At home in his tiny apartment, he'd type furiously, before and after work, documenting everything. The soul-crushing routine, the petty humiliations, the way the job reduced human beings to interchangeable parts in a machine designed to process paper. The poems kept getting published. Small magazines, underground journals, places that paid nothing but gave him proof that someone out there was listening. The work was getting sharper, more focused, less interested in impressing anyone, more interested in telling the truth about what it felt like to be trapped in a system designed to break you. Then in 1952, before returning to the post office permanently, something happened that would haunt his writing for the rest of his life. He met a woman named Barfly. She was a poet from Texas who published a small magazine called Harlequin. She'd been born with a congenital deformity that left her essentially without a neck. She wrote to Bukowski, confessing she feared no one would ever marry her because of her appearance. Bukowski, who had never met her, wrote back and proposed, just like that. They married shortly after. It lasted 2 years. 2 years of alcohol and arguments, and 2 people who were both too damaged to save each other. The marriage collapsed, but it taught Bukowski something important about himself and about writing. He couldn't separate his life from his work. Everything he experienced, every failed relationship, every hangover, every moment of despair or unexpected beauty, all of it went into the poems. After Barbara, there was Jane. Jane Cooney Baker was 10 years older than Bukowski when they met in 1947. She drank the way he did, seriously, constantly, without apology. They understood each other in the way that 2 people circling the drain often do. The relationship was volatile, passionate, destructive. It lasted 7 years. 7 years of fights and reconciliations, of bottles shared and bottles thrown, of tender moments punctuated by violence. She appears throughout his work, thinly disguised as various characters, but always recognizable. The woman who matched him drink for drink. The woman who understood that the drinking wasn't weakness, but necessity. The woman who loved him despite knowing exactly who he was. In 1962, Jane died. Alcohol-related illness. Cancer, cirrhosis, internal hemorrhaging. She went into the hospital during a particularly bad binge and never came out. Bukowski got the news and fell into a depression that lasted months. He kept drinking, kept writing. The poems about her became some of his most raw, most honest work. Love and loss and the realization that the things that sustain you are often the same things that destroy you. The post office kept grinding away. 10 years, more than 10 years, every night the same routine. Clock in, sort mail, avoid supervisors, clock out, go home, Drink, write, sleep a few hours, repeat. His body was breaking down from the work. Back problems, shoulder pain, the constant physical strain of lifting mail sacks and standing for hours. But his writing was getting stronger. In the late 1960s, he started writing a weekly column for an underground newspaper called Open City, Notes of a Dirty Old Man. The title alone told you what to expect. Raw, unfiltered observations about sex, drinking, gambling, work, life in Los Angeles among the people nobody else was writing about. The column made him known in certain circles. Not famous, but known. Word got back to the post office. Management found out their mail clerk was writing a column that included stories about how much he hated his job. They told him to stop. He refused. What were they going to do? Fire him? He'd been fired from better jobs. Besides, he was actually good at the work when he bothered to try. Fast, accurate. He knew the system. In 1964, another woman entered the picture. Frances Smith. They called her Frenchie. She was 42 when she got pregnant with Bukowski's child. It was an accident. Bukowski hated condoms and assumed she was too old to conceive. He was wrong. When he found out he proposed marriage, she said no. She'd rather live together and raise the child without making it official. Marina Louise Bukowski was born on September 7th, 1964. Bukowski's only child. He was 44 years old, working nights at the post office, drinking heavily, writing obsessively. Not exactly ideal father material, but Francis later said he was wonderful with Marina. Attentive, present. He loved her in a way that surprised everyone, including probably himself. The arrangement with Francis didn't last long term as a romantic relationship, but they remained connected through their daughter. Bukowski continued his pattern. Work, drink, write, occasional relationships that burned hot and fast before collapsing. He was building a body of work, poem by poem, but nobody outside the underground literary scene knew who he was. That was about to change. In 1969, a man named John Martin started Black Sparrow Press specifically to publish Bukowski's work. Martin had been following Bukowski's poems in small magazines for years. He recognized something the mainstream publishing world had missed. This wasn't just gutter poetry. This was literature, raw and honest and completely unlike anything else being written at the time. Martin made Bukowski an offer that would change everything. $100 a month for life if Bukowski would quit the post office and write full-time. No contract. Just a handshake and a promise. The money wasn't much, barely enough to survive on, but it was steady. And it came with one condition. Bukowski had to actually write. Bukowski was 49 years old. He'd spent more than a decade sorting mail in the middle of the night. His body was wrecked. His liver was probably shot. He'd published poems in dozens of small magazines, but had never made any real money from writing. This was his chance, maybe his only chance. He accepted. On his last day at the post office, after his final shift, Bukowski walked out of that building and stayed drunk for days. He later described it as flying out of a cage, shooting into the heavens. The relief was overwhelming. No more supervisors. No more fluorescent lights. No more sorting other people's letters while his own words piled up in his head, waiting to be written. Within 3 weeks of quitting, he'd written his first novel, Post Office. The whole thing, beginning to end. It poured out of him in one sustained burst of creative energy. Everything he'd experienced during those years, all the humiliation and boredom and rage, transformed into a novel that would eventually be recognized as a classic of underground literature. The book introduced Henry Chinaski, Bukowski's alter ego, who would appear throughout his novels. The name was a thinly veiled version of his own. Henry from his real first name, Heinrich. Chinaski close enough to Bukowski that everyone would know who he was writing about. The novel was dedicated to nobody, which felt appropriate. It wasn't a gift, it was a document, evidence that he'd survived. Post Office was raw and funny, and brutal. It captured the absurdity of working for an institution that treated human beings as disposable machinery. It showed the small rebellions that keep people sane in soul-crushing jobs, the drinking on breaks, the arguments with supervisors, the camaraderie among workers who knew they were all trapped in the same cage. Critics didn't know what to make of it. This wasn't literature as they understood it. No careful prose, no subtle metaphors. Just direct, simple language describing a life most people preferred to ignore. But readers responded. The underground press championed it. Word spread through counterculture networks. Bukowski had found his audience. Black Sparrow Press kept publishing his work. Poetry collections, more novels. Everything he wrote found an audience hungry for his particular brand of honesty. He wasn't romanticizing poverty or suffering. He was documenting it, showing what it actually felt like to be on the bottom, looking up at a world that didn't care whether you lived or died. His life settled into a new rhythm. No more post office, just writing and drinking and gambling on horses and relationships that continued their pattern of intensity, followed by destruction. In 1970, he met Linda King, a sculptor and poet. She was 30, he was 50. The relationship was volcanic, passionate and violent by turns. King later reported that Bukowski broke her nose during an argument in 1971. He didn't deny it. The violence was part of who he was, something he'd learned from his father and never fully unlearned. It's the part of his legacy that makes people uncomfortable, and it should. You can admire the writing while acknowledging the damage the man caused. The relationship with King eventually ended, but not before she'd sculpted his head, capturing in clay the face that had been ruined by acne decades earlier. The sculpture exists still, a permanent record of what all that living had done to him. Every line earned through suffering and alcohol, and refusing to look away from the ugliest parts of existence. By the mid-1970s, Bukowski was becoming something he'd never expected to be. Successful. Not wealthy, but known. His books were selling. His readings drew crowds. The underground had embraced him completely, and the mainstream was starting to pay attention, even if they weren't sure what to make of him. He was 55 years old, still drinking heavily, still writing constantly, still living the life he'd always lived. Except now people were watching. Now his words were reaching audiences far beyond the small magazines that had published him for decades. The man who'd spent his life on the margins was moving toward the centre, dragging all his demons with him. In 1976, a woman walked into one of Bukowski's readings who would change everything. Her name was Linda Lee Byle. She owned a health food restaurant. She was a fan of his work, but she was different from the others who approached him after readings. She didn't throw herself at him. She didn't treat him like a literary celebrity or a curiosity. She just talked to him like a person. Bukowski was 56 years old. His face bore the accumulated damage of decades of drinking, the scars from the teenage acne that had never fully faded, the broken capillaries, the lines carved by a life spent refusing to look away from ugly truths. He expected women to sleep with him quickly, or not at all. That's how it had always worked. Linda refused. For months, she refused. They talked instead, went to dinners, spent time together without the immediate collapse into bed that had characterized his previous relationships. This was new territory. Bukowski didn't know what to do with someone who actually wanted to know him rather than just experience him. Slowly, something shifted. The relationship that developed wasn't the volcanic intensity he'd known with Jane or Linda King. It was quieter, more stable. In 1978, they moved in together, leaving East Hollywood, where Bukowski had lived most of his adult life. They relocated to San Pedro, the southernmost district of Los Angeles, a harbor community that felt separate from the city proper. San Pedro was blue-collar, working class. Ships came and went. Longshoremen worked the docks. It wasn't glamorous or literary. It was exactly the kind of place Bukowski understood. They rented a house, painted it pink, which became a detail his readers would latch onto later. The house at Carlton Way in San Pedro would become as much a part of his legend as the racetrack or the typewriter. Linda brought something Bukowski had never really experienced: stability without suffocation. She didn't try to change him. She knew who he was when she got involved. The drinking continued, the gambling continued, the writing continued. But there was a foundation now, someone who actually cared whether he lived or died, and who didn't make that care feel like a trap. They married in 1985. Bukowski was 65 years old. The ceremony was performed by Manly Palmer Hall, a Canadian-born mystic and writer. It wasn't a traditional wedding. Nothing about Bukowski was traditional, but it was real. After decades of failed relationships and self-destruction, he'd found something that actually worked. Director Taylor Hackford, who'd known Bukowski since the early 70s, later said that Linda added a decade to his life. Without her, the drinking would have killed him years earlier. With her, he had a reason to occasionally moderate. Not stop, never stop, but pull back from the absolute edge he'd been living on for so long. The work kept coming. Black Sparrow Press published everything he wrote. Poetry collections appeared regularly. Mockingbird, Wish Me Luck in 1972. Love is a Dog from Hell in 1977. That title alone captured his entire philosophy about relationships. War All the Time in 1984. You Get So Alone, at times that it just makes sense in 1986. The poetry was getting better, which shouldn't have been possible for someone drinking as heavily as Bukowski still drank. But the years of practice, the thousands of poems, they'd honed something. The voice was clearer now, more direct. The early poems had sometimes tried too hard to shock. These later poems didn't need to try. They just were. His prose output expanded too. Factotum came out in 1975, following Henry Chinaski through his wandering years. The jobs, the women, the drinking, all of it rendered in that same flat, direct style that made the grotesque feel ordinary and the ordinary feel grotesque. Women appeared in 1978, chronicling Chinaski's relationships with the same brutal honesty Bukowski brought to everything. The book didn't romanticize or apologize. It showed the damage people do to each other when they're broken and desperate and using sex as a temporary escape from emptiness. Then in 1982 came Ham on Rye, his most autobiographical novel. The story of Henry Chinaski's childhood and young adulthood. The father who beat him with a razor strop. The acne that made him a monster in his own eyes. The discovery of alcohol and literature as ways to survive a world that seemed designed to destroy sensitive people. Critics who'd dismissed his earlier work as crude had to reckon with Ham on Rye. The Los Angeles Times Book Review called it taut, vivid, intense, sometimes poignant, often hilarious. This wasn't just shock value anymore. This was literature. Raw and unpolished in deliberate ways, but undeniably powerful. The book captured something essential about how trauma shapes people, how the violence you experience as a child doesn't just hurt in the moment. It rewires you, changes how you see yourself and everyone around you. Bukowski didn't psychoanalyze this. He just showed it happening, which made it more devastating than any explanation could have been. Through all of this, Bukowski maintained his routine. He wrote every night, started typing around dark, worked until the early morning hours, drank while he wrote, listened to classical music. The routine was sacred. It was the one thing that couldn't be compromised. He gave readings more frequently now, packed auditoriums of people who came to see the legend in person, the dirty old man of American letters, the poet of Skid Row. He'd show up, often drunk, and read his work with that gravelly voice that sounded like it had been marinated in whiskey and cigarettes for decades. The readings were performances in their own way. People wanted the Bukowski they'd read about. The drunk, the fighter, the man who didn't give a damn what anyone thought. And he delivered. Insults for hecklers, crude jokes, the occasional near collapse from too much drinking before taking the stage. but he also read the work. And when he read, something happened. The poems that looked simple on the page gained weight when spoken in his voice. The flat delivery somehow emphasized the emotion underneath. You could hear the life that had produced these words, the survival. His audience wasn't the literary establishment. It was outsiders, working people who'd never bought a poetry book before Bukowski, college students who felt alienated from the sanitized literature their professors assigned, anyone who'd ever felt like they didn't fit, like the world was designed for someone else. He became a cult figure, not mainstream famous, but known in certain circles. The underground press treated him like royalty. European publishers translated his work. He had readers in Germany, in France, in places he'd never visit. The kid who'd been born in Andernach and brought to America as a small child had somehow circled back, his words returning to Europe in translation. Money started coming in. Not wealth, but enough to live on comfortably. The $100 a month from John Martin had been supplemented by royalties. The book sold steadily. Not bestseller numbers, but consistent. A dedicated audience that bought everything he published and told their friends. Bukowski bought a BMW. This detail delighted his critics. Here was the poet of the downtrodden, driving a luxury German car. The hypocrisy seemed obvious, but Bukowski never claimed to be politically consistent. He liked what he liked. He'd grown up poor, and he'd been poor most of his life. Now he had money, and he spent it on things he enjoyed. Horses, wine, a decent car. The writing about poverty didn't require him to remain poor. He documented that life, survived it. He didn't owe anyone continued suffering for the sake of authenticity. Through the 80s, the output continued. More poetry, more prose, interviews with magazines that wanted to understand this phenomenon. Who was this guy? How did he do it? What made him keep writing when he could have retired comfortably? He didn't have good answers to these questions. He wrote because he wrote. It's what he did. The same way some people go to an office every day, he sat at his typewriter every night. It was work, necessary work. The only work he knew how to do that mattered. In 1987, something unexpected happened. Hollywood came calling. Not for a documentary or a small art film. For a real movie, with real actors, based on his life. The project was called Barfly. The screenplay was written by Bukowski himself, adapting his own experiences into something that could work on screen. Mickey Rourke would play Henry Chinaski. Faye Dunaway would play Wanda Wilcox, a character based on various women from Bukowski's past. The production was everything you'd expect from a movie about Bukowski's life. Fights on set, drinking, arguments with the director, Barbet Schroeder, who'd bought the rights and pushed the project for years. Bukowski hated the process, hated Hollywood, hated the compromise inherent in turning lived experience into entertainment. But he did it anyway, wrote the script, visited the set, watched actors pretend to be him, pretend to live the life he'd actually lived. It was surreal, disturbing in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The movie came out in 1987. Critics were divided. Some praised its raw honesty, others called it self-indulgent. Rourke's performance was committed, capturing something of Bukowski's swagger and self-destruction, but it was still Hollywood. Still polished in ways the real life had never been. Bukowski took the whole experience and turned it into another novel. Hollywood, published in 1989, chronicled the making of Barfly from the perspective of an aging Henry Chinaski, watching his life become a commodity. It was funny and sad and angry all at once, a meditation on what happens when the underground gets discovered by the mainstream. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his life as an outsider, documenting the lives of people the culture ignored. Now the culture wanted in, wanted to package and sell the very authenticity that had made his work valuable in the first place. The moment something becomes sellable, it stops being what it was. But the money was real, the attention was real, and Bukowski was approaching 70 years old. He'd survived longer than he'd expected, longer than he probably should have, given the decades of abuse he'd put his body through. The drinking continued, but he'd slowed down slightly. Linda's influence maybe, or just age catching up. The hangovers lasted longer now. The recovery took more time, but he still drank, still gambled on horses, still wrote every night. The routine held. That's what mattered. As long as he could sit at the typewriter, as long as the words kept coming, he was still alive in the only way that counted. Everything else was just details. The fame, the money, the movies. None of it mattered as much as the work itself. And the work kept coming, because that's what he did. That's who he was. The man who'd survived his father's beatings, and the post office, and Jane's death, and his own self-destruction through the simple act of putting words on paper. One poem at a time. One story at a time. Building a body of work that documented a life most people preferred to ignore. He was still that kid who'd discovered the public library and realised that books could save you. Still the young man who'd found John Fante and understood that you could write about real life, about suffering and survival, without making it pretty or noble. Still the postal worker who typed poems on his lunch break because the words demanded to exist. The world had changed around him. He'd gone from complete obscurity to cult fame, but the core remained the same. The typewriter, the bottle, the blank page waiting to be filled with whatever truth he could extract from another day of being alive. By the early 90s, something was shifting. The body that had survived decades of punishment was finally sending clear signals that the bill was coming due. The hangovers weren't just lasting longer, they were becoming events unto themselves. Days lost to nausea and shaking hands. The liver that had processed an ocean of cheap wine was starting to fail. But he kept drinking. Not at the same rate maybe, not with the same reckless abandon of his youth, but enough to maintain the ritual. The evening drink at the typewriter, the way alcohol loosened something in his brain that allowed the words to flow without the interference of self-consciousness. Linda watched it all with the patience of someone who understood that trying to change him would be pointless. She'd known who he was when they got together, a man who drank and gambled and wrote about drinking and gambling. Asking him to stop would be like asking him to stop breathing. So she didn't ask, she just made sure he ate something, made sure he didn't completely destroy himself. Added those extra years that director Taylor Hackford credited her with giving him. The house in San Pedro had become his fortress. The neighbourhood was working class, unpretentious, the kind of place where nobody cared if you were famous or published books. The harbour was nearby. He could hear foghorns at night. It felt right, more authentic than the Hollywood Hills or some literary colony in the northeast. This was his territory. The docks and dive bars and cheap apartments. He'd written about these places for 40 years. Living among them made sense. His daily routine had calcified into something almost sacred. Wake up late, feed the cats. They had several now. Linda's influence again. He'd never been much for pets before her, but the cats were easy. They didn't demand conversation or emotional labour. They just existed in the same space, occasionally demanding food or attention on their own terms. He could relate to that, then to the typewriter, every single day, no exceptions. Didn't matter if he felt inspired or not. Didn't matter if the previous night's drinking had left him barely functional. He sat down and typed. Sometimes it was poetry, sometimes fragments of prose, sometimes just notes and observations. The act mattered more than the output. The discipline of showing up and doing the work regardless of circumstances or mood. The question of legacy was starting to intrude more frequently. Not that he particularly cared about being remembered, but other people cared. Interviewers would ask what he wanted his writing to accomplish, what message he hoped to leave behind. He'd give them the same answer every time. No message, no grand purpose, just documenting what he saw and felt. Being honest about the parts of life most writers avoided or prettied up. But honesty is complicated. because the Bukowski of the page wasn't quite the same as the Bukowski who lived in San Pedro with Linda and the cats. The persona he'd created, the dirty old man who drank and fought and screwed his way through existence, that was based on truth, but it was also performance, a heightened version of reality designed for maximum impact on the page. The real Bukowski was quieter, more domestic than his readers probably imagined. He liked classical music, loved his daughter Marina, though their relationship was complicated by years of distance and his own limitations as a father. He could be tender with Linda in ways that never made it into the poems, could spend hours just reading or listening to music without the chaos that defined his public image. Which version was real? Both. Neither. The question itself was probably wrong. People contain multitudes, the drunk and the father, the savage and the romantic, the cynic who wrote love poems. All of it existed simultaneously without contradiction because life itself is contradictory. His health continued deteriorating. In 1993, he was diagnosed with leukemia. The doctors gave him estimates, timeframes, probabilities. He listened with the same detachment he'd brought to everything else. Death had been a frequent character in his work. He'd written about it for decades, contemplated it during his darkest periods, watched it take Jane and others. Now it was coming for him, and the prospect didn't inspire fear so much as a kind of weary acceptance. He kept writing. The leukemia didn't change that. If anything, it added urgency, not because he felt he had important things to say before time ran out, but because writing was what he did, who he was. Stopping would be a kind of death in itself. So he typed, slower now, with more breaks, but the work continued. The poems from this period are remarkable. No self-pity, no grand statements about mortality, just the same clear-eyed observation of daily life now filtered through the lens of a body failing. He wrote about doctors' appointments, the indignities of illness, the strange peace that comes from knowing approximately when your story ends. Publishers wanted more. There was always demand for new Bukowski. Black Sparrow Press had been releasing his work steadily for 25 years. Collections of poems, new novels, reprints of earlier material. The catalogue was extensive, but readers wanted fresh content, proof that the old man still had it. He delivered. Pulp came out in 1994, just months before his death. A detective novel, deliberately trashy, full of the noir conventions he'd grown up reading. It was playful in a way his earlier work hadn't been, like he'd given himself permission to just have fun, to write something purely for entertainment, without worrying about literary merit or authentic experience. The book reads like a farewell, not intentionally maybe, but looking back it's hard not to see it that way. One last genre exercise from a writer who'd spent his career defying genre expectations. A crime novel from someone who'd made his name writing autobiographical poetry. The joke was on everyone who tried to categorize him. March 1994. The leukemia had progressed to the point where he knew the end was close. He'd lived longer than expected, made it to 73. Not bad for someone who'd been trying to drink himself to death since his 20s. The final weeks were difficult. Pain management, hospital visits, the machinery of modern medicine trying to extract a few more days. Linda was there throughout, managing the chaos, keeping the various vultures at bay. There were always people who wanted something from him. Interviews, manuscripts, memorabilia. The price of fame was that your death became public property, but she protected him as much as possible. Let him spend his final days with some dignity. He wrote until nearly the end. The very last poem was titled, "We Ain't Got No Money, Honey, But We Got Rain," typed on March 9th, 1994, hours before he died. It's a love poem, simple, direct, about being broke and old and sick but having someone to weather it with. The final lines thank Linda for being there, for loving him despite everything. He died that night. Leukemia, at home in San Pedro. Linda was with him. The man who'd spent decades writing about loneliness and isolation didn't die alone. There's something fitting about that. His work documented solitary suffering, but his end was witnessed, mourned. The contradiction held even then. News spread quickly through the literary underground. Then the mainstream press picked it up. Obituaries appeared in major newspapers, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times. They tried to sum up a life in a few hundred words. Underground poet, chronicler of America's underbelly, voice of the dispossessed, all true, all inadequate. The funeral was small, friends and family, no grand public memorial. He wouldn't have wanted that. Linda scattered his ashes off the coast of San Pedro, into the Pacific, the same ocean he could hear from his writing desk, where the foghorns sounded at night. It felt right, returning to the elements, no grave marker, no monument, just the work left behind. And the work was substantial. Over 60 books published during his lifetime, thousands more poems in manuscript, letters, notebooks, the accumulated output of someone who'd made writing his religion, his salvation, his reason for surviving when survival seemed pointless. Black Sparrow Press continued publishing posthumous collections, material he'd left behind, poems that hadn't made it into previous volumes. The archive was deep. Even in death he remained productive, new books appearing every few years, keeping his presence alive for readers who discovered him late or wanted more. His daughter Marina inherited his estate, took on the responsibility of managing his literary legacy. It wasn't easy. Her relationship with her father had been complicated, long absences, his drinking, the impossibility of living up to being Charles Bukowski's daughter. But she handled it with grace, protected his work while allowing it to reach new audiences. The cultural impact kept expanding. Young writers discovered him, found permission in his work to write about their own unglamorous lives, to use profanity and describe sex and admit to failure without shame. He'd opened a door, shown that literature didn't have to be polite or respectable to be valuable. Academic interest grew. The same institutions that had ignored him during his life began teaching his work, writing dissertations about it, analysing his influence on American literature. He'd have found this funny. The establishment finally accepting the outsider after he was safely dead and couldn't cause any more trouble. His books kept selling. New editions, translations into dozens of languages, readers in Germany and Japan and France connecting with stories written in Los Angeles dive bars. Proof that certain experiences transcend culture. Loneliness, desperation, the search for meaning in meaningless circumstances. These are universal. The persona he'd created, the dirty old man, became almost mythological, separated from the actual person who'd lived in San Pedro with his cats and his wife. Young men especially adopted him as an icon, the rebel, the truth teller, the guy who didn't give a damn what anyone thought, missing the complexity, the vulnerability hidden beneath the tough guy exterior. But maybe that's inevitable. Dead writers become symbols. Their messy humanity gets smoothed into narrative. Bukowski the myth was simpler than Bukowski the man, easier to understand, easier to market. The actual person, with his contradictions and tenderness and fear, got lost in the icon. Still, the best work survives these distortions. You can read the poems and find the real person underneath the performance. The guy who loved his daughter, who needed Linda, who was scared and lonely and trying to make sense of existence through language. That's all still there if you look for it. 25 years after his death, the work remains vital, not dated, not a period piece, because he wrote about fundamentals, work, love, death, survival. These don't change. The specific details shift, but the core experiences remain constant across decades and cultures. His influence on contemporary poetry is undeniable. You can trace a direct line from his work to countless poets writing today. The conversational tone, the willingness to write about unglamorous subjects, the rejection of academic language in favour of direct communication. These are now standard approaches, but they weren't when he started. The novels hold up differently. Post Office remains his strongest. The others are uneven. Ham on Rye captures something essential about damaged youth. Women is problematic in ways that become more apparent with time. Hollywood is funny but slight. Pulp is pure entertainment. But even the weaker books have moments. Passages where the prose catches fire, and you remember why people cared. The poetry is where his legacy lives strongest. Those thousands of poems written across 5 decades. Some brilliant, some mediocre, but taken together, they form a portrait of a life lived without apology, without pretension. Just one man's attempt to document his passage through time with honesty and precision. That's what endures, not the drinking or the fighting or the persona, the words themselves, the poems that continue speaking to readers who find in them recognition of their own struggles, their own failures, their own stubborn insistence on surviving despite everything. Bukowski died, but the work didn't. It continues finding new readers, continues mattering to people who feel outside the mainstream, who see their own lives reflected in his unflinching descriptions of disappointment and persistence. That's the only legacy that matters. The rest is just noise. The question everyone asks is why he matters now. What's the point of reading a dead drunk from the 70s who wrote about bar fights and hangovers? Fair question. Deserves a real answer. Start with the obvious. His style changed poetry. Before Bukowski, most American poetry was academic, dense, referential. You needed a degree to decode it. The confessional poets had broken some ground, but they still wrote like they'd gone to good schools. Which they had. Bukowski wrote like he'd gone nowhere, like he'd learned English in the gutter. Short lines, simple words, no classical allusions, no mythology except the mythology of being broke and desperate. This wasn't anti-intellectualism. It was a different kind of intelligence, the intelligence of someone who'd actually lived the life he wrote about, who wasn't performing poverty from a tenured position. The poems came from experience, not research. You can feel the difference. The academic poets wrote about alienation. Bukowski wrote from inside it. His influence shows up everywhere now. Spoken word poetry, hip-hop lyrics. The whole aesthetic of authenticity in contemporary writing traces partly back to him. The idea that raw honesty beats polished craft, that lived experience trumps formal education. These are Bukowski's arguments, made flesh in 1,000 different styles. But influence isn't the same as quality. Lots of bad writers have been influential. What actually makes the work good? The best poems have this quality of inevitability, like the language couldn't have been any other way. Bluebird does this, the metaphor of a fragile bird trapped inside a tough exterior. It's obvious once you read it, but you'd never think of it yourself. The execution is what matters. The way the poem builds, the repetition, the final image of the bird dying because the speaker won't let it out. That's craft, real craft, not the craft of meter and rhyme, the craft of knowing exactly how much to say and when to stop. Bukowski understood economy, how to cut everything that wasn't essential. His poems feel loose and improvised, but they're actually tight as hell. Every word earns its place. The novels are different, looser, more willing to meander. Post Office succeeds because it captures the feeling of time passing slowly in a job you hate. The repetition is intentional, day after day of the same. The prose rhythm mirrors the experience. Ham on Rye works because it nails the humiliation of adolescence, the father's violence, the acne, the desperate need to escape. These aren't subtle books, but they're honest ones. Women is where things get complicated. The book is deeply misogynistic. No way around that. Chinaski treats women terribly, uses them, discards them. The defense is that it's character, not author. That Bukowski is showing you an asshole, not endorsing one. Maybe. But the line gets blurry. The book revels in the behaviour it supposedly critiques. Readers respond to that revel. They miss the supposed critique entirely. This points to a larger problem. Bukowski created a persona so compelling that people confused it with a philosophy. The dirty old man wasn't meant to be aspirational. He was a character, a way of processing experience through exaggeration and performance. But young men read the books and thought they'd found a role model, instructions for living. Be hard, drink heavy, don't let anyone tell you what to do. That's a shallow reading, but it's the reading that happened. Still happens. Walk into any college dorm and you'll find Bukowski on someone's shelf. Usually, someone who thinks being an arsehole makes them interesting. The work enables this misreading. The books are funny. They make destruction look appealing. The consequences show up, but they're filtered through humour and bravado. Easy to miss the pain underneath. The poems are harder to misread. When he writes about loneliness, it cuts. When he writes about aging, it's devastating. The laughing heart tells you to seize life while you can. The proud, thin dying shows you what happens when you don't. These aren't tough guy poems. They're vulnerable, scared, human. That's the real Bukowski, the guy underneath the act. You find him in unexpected places, in the poems about his daughter, about his cats, about sitting in his yard in San Pedro, watching the ships come in. These moments reveal someone gentle, someone who wanted connection despite the persona that pushed everyone away. The contradiction is what makes him interesting, the tension between the hard exterior and the soft interior, between the performance and the person. His best work lives in that tension, acknowledges it, uses it. Hollywood is basically about this. The character Chinaski navigating the movie business, trying to maintain his outsider status while dealing with money and fame. The book is funny, but it's also sad. You watch someone realize they've become what they always mocked. That success doesn't feel like they thought it would. That getting what you want might be worse than not getting it. This is mature work, self-aware work, far from the simple tough guy stories of the early novels. Bukowski at 68 writing about Bukowski at 68. No longer pretending to be immortal or invincible. Just an old man trying to make sense of an unlikely late career success. The late poems show this evolution too. Less drinking, more reflection, more appreciation for small things. The garden, the cats, Linda. You can feel him softening, not in a bad way, in a human way, letting the bluebird out a little, risking the vulnerability he'd spent decades hiding. So you want to be a writer? Is late Bukowski at his best. It's advice, but it's also autobiography. Don't do it unless it comes out of you like a rocket, unless not doing it would kill you. That's how he felt about writing. It wasn't a choice, it was survival, the only way he knew to process existence. This is why the work matters, not because of the drinking or the fighting, because of what he did with the pain. He turned it into art, not therapy disguised as art, actual art. Language arranged in ways that make you feel something, that show you parts of human experience usually hidden. The drunk poems aren't celebrations of alcoholism, they're examinations of what happens when you use substances to cope with reality. Sometimes funny, often tragic, always honest about the cost. Read Beer or Dinosauria We, and you'll see someone who knows exactly what alcohol does, who drinks anyway, because the alternative feels worse. His politics are messy. He hated work, hated authority, hated anything that tried to control him. But he wasn't ideological, wasn't trying to start a revolution, just wanted to be left alone, to write, to drink, to live on his own terms. This appealed to the counterculture, but Bukowski was never really part of it. Too old, too cynical, too suspicious of movements and causes. He wrote about the working class because he was working class, not as an observer, but as a participant. The post office poems come from someone who actually sorted mail for 12 years, who knows what it feels like to drag yourself to a job you hate because you need the money. This is rare in American literature. Most working class narratives are written by people who escaped, who went to college and became writers. Bukowski was the thing itself, never fully escaped, carried the post office with him forever. That authenticity is valuable. It's also limiting. He wrote about what he knew, which meant he missed huge swaths of experience. No politics beyond personal resentment, no engagement with social movements, no real understanding of how power works beyond the immediate. His worldview was narrow, deliberately so. But within that narrow space he went deep, deeper than most. He understood humiliation, desperation, the small victories of surviving another day, the way poverty grinds you down, the way alcohol provides temporary relief before making everything worse. These aren't abstract concepts in his work. They're lived reality, described with precision. The criticism he faced during his lifetime was mostly about the language and content. Too violent, too sexual, too crude. Critics who hated him focused on surface elements, missed the craft underneath, the careful construction, the way he built poems that looked artless, but were actually highly controlled. Now the criticism is different. Gender stuff mostly. The way he wrote about women, the violence, the objectification. These are legitimate criticisms. You can't wave them away by saying it was a different time. The work contains real misogyny. Whether that's character or author is debatable, but the impact is the same. Women reading these books often feel excluded, objectified, reduced to bodies and obstacles. Some defend this as unflinching honesty. This is how men actually think. Bukowski isn't endorsing it, just showing it. Maybe. But showing without critique is its own kind of endorsement, especially when the showing is done with such obvious relish. The better defense is that the work is bigger than its worst elements, that you can acknowledge the misogyny while still valuing what's good. The poems about loneliness, about class, about work, about aging and death. These don't require hating women to work. They stand independent of the gender politics. This is an uncomfortable position, easier to either worship or reject completely. But most art is complicated, contains good and bad simultaneously. The question is whether the good outweighs the bad, whether there's enough value to justify engaging with the problems. For Bukowski, the answer is yes, barely. The best work justifies wading through the worst. But you have to wade, have to acknowledge what's there. Can't pretend the problems don't exist. His legacy now is split. Academic interest has grown. Dissertations get written, conferences held, the work is taught in universities. This would have amused him. The outsider brought inside. The guy who hated school, becoming required reading. But he's also still popular outside academia, still read by people who don't read much poetry, who wouldn't touch most literary fiction, but will read Bukowski. This is rare. Most writers are either academic or popular, not both. Bukowski managed to be both by being neither, by writing in a way that satisfied different audiences for different reasons. The academic readers appreciate the craft, the control, the way he manipulated language and structure. The popular readers appreciate the attitude, the rebellion, the sense that someone is telling them the truth. Both readings are valid. Both find something real in the work. What gets lost sometimes is the sadness. The work is funny, but it's also deeply sad. Chinaski is a lonely character. So is Bukowski. The drinking and fighting are symptoms, not solutions. The whole project is an attempt to survive unbearable circumstances, to find meaning where there isn't any, to keep going when everything says stop. That's universal. Everyone feels that sometimes. The desperation, the sense that life is grinding you down, the need for something, anything, to make it bearable. Bukowski found writing, and drinking, and women, and horses. These were his tools for survival. Not good tools necessarily, but tools. The poems document this survival. Show you someone making it through one more day, then another, until suddenly he's old, successful, married to Linda, living in San Pedro, looking back at a life that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. That's the story. Not the drinking or the fighting, the survival, the persistence, the refusal to quit despite everything, despite the pain and the failure and the loneliness. The final years didn't soften him much. Linda brought stability, but Bukowski remained Bukowski. Still wrote about drinking, still wrote about women, still wrote about horses and hangovers and the absurdity of everything. The difference was he wasn't living it the same way. He'd found something resembling peace, or at least a truce with existence. San Pedro became his permanent home in 1978, a working-class harbour town at the southern edge of Los Angeles. Not glamorous, not trendy, just a place where longshoremen and fishermen lived, where you could still find cheap rent and nobody cared who you were. Bukowski fit there. He'd spent his whole life in Los Angeles, but always on the margins. East Hollywood, Skid Row, the forgotten neighborhoods. San Pedro was different. He wasn't hiding there. He'd bought a house, had a yard, lived like a normal person. The house on Carlton Way became famous later. Fans would drive by, take pictures. Bukowski hated that. He'd put up curtains, yell at people to leave, but mostly he just worked. The routine was simple. Wake up, feed the cats, make coffee, write. He'd write in the morning when his mind was clear, poetry mostly. The novels required more sustained effort, but the poems came daily, like breathing, like any other bodily function. Black Sparrow kept publishing everything. A new book every year sometimes. Poetry collections, short story collections, novels. The market existed now. People wanted Bukowski, wanted that voice, that attitude. The underground had become overground. The outsider was inside, making money, getting reviewed, being taught in universities, the exact thing he'd spent decades mocking. He handled success strangely, accepted it but didn't trust it, knew it could disappear, knew the audience might leave. So he kept writing like he was still broke, still desperate, still trying to prove something. The productivity was astonishing. At an age when most writers slow down, Bukowski accelerated, wrote more, published more, kept the machine running. The drinking continued but changed form. Less binge drinking, more steady maintenance, wine instead of whiskey mostly. He'd sit at his desk with a bottle, write, drink, write. The alcohol was part of the process, not a hindrance, not a romantic accessory, just a tool, like the typewriter, like the paper, something that made the work possible. Critics still dismissed him. Academic journals still ignored him. The literary establishment still considered him crude, unserious, too popular to be important. This bothered him less now. He had readers, had money, had a life that worked. The approval of people he'd always hated seemed pointless. Why chase validation from the very system you'd rejected? But something was shifting in how people read him. The early audience had been mostly men, mostly young, mostly drawn to the drinking and fighting. The rebellion by the 1980s that was changing. Women started reading him, finding something beyond the misogyny. Older readers discovered him. People who'd lived through their own versions of his struggles. The readings continued. He'd fly to different cities, read to packed halls. People loved watching him. The performance was part of the appeal. He'd sit there, drink, read, insult the audience, make jokes, then read something that would break your heart. The contrast was the point. The asshole persona protecting something vulnerable underneath. Hollywood came calling in the mid-1980s. Barfly got made. Mickey Rourke as Chinaski, Faye Dunaway as Wanda, based on his relationship with Jane, the drinking years, the bars and the fights and the chaos. Bukowski wrote the screenplay, fought with the director, fought with the producers, then watched them make something that actually worked. The film captured something, not everything. You can't put Bukowski's voice on screen completely. But Rourke got the slouch right, the weariness, the way Chinaski moved through the world like he expected to get hit. Dunaway made Wanda more dignified than Jane had been, cleaner, less destroyed, But the core was there. Two people drinking themselves to death, finding brief connection. Bukowski hated the Hollywood process, the meetings, the rewrites, the compromises. He wrote about it in Hollywood, the novel, made it funny, made the whole thing absurd, but also captured the weird thrill of seeing your life turned into product, your pain monetized, your struggles packaged for consumption. The book came out in 1989. Critics called it minor Bukowski, not as raw as the early work. Too comfortable, too self-aware. Maybe they were right, but it sold. People bought it, read it, wanted more. The machine kept running. His health started failing around this time. The decades of drinking were catching up. Tuberculosis had scarred his lungs back in the 1950s. Now he developed emphysema. Breathing became difficult. He'd cough, hack, spit, keep writing. The body was breaking down, but the mind stayed sharp. The words kept coming. Linda managed everything. The house, the finances, the publishers, the fans. She protected him, gave him space to work, kept the chaos at bay. People credit her with keeping him alive those last years. He probably would have drunk himself to death otherwise, or just given up. She gave him a reason not to. Marina visited sometimes. His daughter, now grown, they had a complicated relationship. He'd been absent for much of her childhood, working, drinking, writing. Now he tried to connect, tried to be a father. It didn't come naturally. He was better at writing about relationships than living them. But they tried, found some kind of understanding. The cats multiplied. Bukowski loved cats, wrote about them constantly. They didn't judge, didn't want anything except food and warmth, didn't care about his reputation or his work, just existed. He respected that, filled the house with them, gave them ridiculous names, wrote poems about their deaths. He started thinking about death more. Not morbidly, just practically. He was getting old, sick. The end was visible. He wrote about it, made it funny when he could, made it honest when he couldn't. The late poems have this quality, this awareness, this looking back at everything and trying to figure out what it meant. What did it mean? He'd survived. That was something. Survived the beatings and the acne and the poverty. The writing changed in subtle ways, got quieter, less aggressive. The anger was still there but tired now, worn down. He'd said what he needed to say, proven what he needed to prove. Now he was just documenting, recording what remained, trying to get it down before the time ran out. People started calling him an icon, an American original, the voice of the underclass. He hated that, rejected it, kept insisting he was just a guy who wrote. Nothing special, nothing important, just someone who'd figured out how to turn pain into words, into something people wanted to read. But he was special, is special. Not because of the lifestyle, not because of the myth, because of the work, because he found a way to write about ordinary suffering that felt true. That didn't romanticize or sentimentalize. That just showed you what it was like, what it felt like, to be broke and drunk and alone, to want something better but not know how to get it, to keep going anyway. The last books have this quality, this finality. You Get So Alone, At Times That It Just Makes Sense came out in 1986. The title says it all. The loneliness isn't tragic anymore, just factual, just the condition of existence. You accept it, work with it, find meaning despite it, or because of it. Septuagenarian Stew appeared in 1990. Old man poems, looking back, looking around, seeing death approaching. Not afraid exactly, just aware, just noting what's happening, the body failing, the world changing, the end coming. He documented it all, made it funny when possible, made it honest always. The Last Night of the Earth poems came out in 1992, 2 years before he died. The title is apocalyptic, but the poems aren't. They're quiet, observational, noticing small things. the light through the window, the cat sleeping, Linda in the other room, the ordinary moments that make up a life. That's what matters at the end. Not the dramatic stuff, the quiet stuff. He died on March 9th, 73 years old, at home in San Pedro, surrounded by the life he'd built, the life he'd written, the life that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. The funeral was small, private, no big ceremony. He would have hated that. They cremated him, scattered some ashes at the racetrack. He would have liked that. The rest went in an urn, in the ground, at Green Hills Memorial Park. Simple headstone, just the name and dates, no epitaph, no grand statement, just facts. The work outlived him immediately. Black Sparrow kept publishing. Posthumous collections, uncollected poems, letters, everything. The archive was massive. He'd written so much, left so much behind. More kept appearing, more books, more material. The machine kept running even without him. His reputation grew after death, always does. The controversial figure becomes the legendary figure. The problems get minimized. The achievements get emphasized. He becomes safe, becomes history, becomes something you can study without engaging with the mess. But the mess is the point, the contradictions, the failures, the ugliness, alongside the beauty. You can't separate them. Can't take the good and ignore the bad. It's all connected. All part of the same project. The same attempt to show you what it's really like, not what it should be like, what it is. That's his legacy, not the drinking stories, not the tough guy persona. The honesty, the willingness to show you the worst parts, to admit failure, to document struggle without pretending there's a solution. Life is hard, people are flawed. Love doesn't save you, work doesn't save you, nothing saves you. You just keep going, keep surviving, keep finding small moments of beauty in the wreckage. That sounds bleak, but it's not. It's realistic. It's acknowledging that meaning isn't given, it's created through work, through persistence, through refusing to quit even when quitting makes sense. Bukowski created meaning through writing, through turning his suffering into something other people could recognize, could use, could find comfort in. Thousands of people read him and think, yes, that's it. That's what it feels like. To be broke, to be alone, to be stuck in a job you hate, to drink too much, to fail at relationships, to keep trying anyway. He gave them language for it, gave them permission to acknowledge it, gave them a voice that said, your struggle matters even if nobody else notices. He didn't save anyone. That's important to understand. He wasn't offering solutions, wasn't providing therapy, wasn't telling you how to fix your life. He was just saying, I see you. Your pain is real. Your struggle counts, even if nobody else acknowledges it. That's radical in its own way. Not the politics, not the rebellion. The simple act of witnessing, of saying, yes, this is hard. Yes, you're suffering. No, there's no easy answer. But you're not crazy for feeling this way. His influence spreads in strange directions. Musicians cite him. Tom Waits, Nick Cave, bands nobody expected. Visual artists, photographers, filmmakers, people working in forms he never touched. They all point back to him. Say he gave them permission. Permission to show the ugly parts, to be honest about failure, to acknowledge that most of life isn't dramatic. It's just grinding. Day after day, trying to survive. Young writers still discover him, still feel that shock of recognition, still think this is exactly what I needed. Because he's showing them it's possible. You don't need credentials, don't need approval from the establishment, don't need to write like anyone else. Just write what you see, write what you know, write what hurts. The danger is imitation. Thousands try to copy him, copy the style, the attitude, the subject matter. Most failed, because they missed the point. The style came from the life, came from actual experience. You can't fake that, can't manufacture authenticity by copying surface details. Bukowski worked because he was writing his actual life, his actual thoughts, his actual failures. When someone else tries to write like Bukowski without living like Bukowski, it rings false, becomes performance, becomes exactly what he was reacting against. The pose, the pretense, his misogyny remains a problem. Can't ignore it, can't excuse it, can't pretend it's just a product of his time. Other men from his generation treated women better, made better choices, had healthier relationships. He didn't. That's on him. You can acknowledge the writing's power while condemning the behaviour, can recognise what he captured about working-class life while rejecting his treatment of women, can appreciate the honesty while wishing he'd been honest about his own cruelty. The contradictions don't resolve. They just sit there, part of the record. His relationship with money changed over time. Early years he had none, wrote about poverty from the inside. Post-office years, he had enough. Barely, wrote about the anxiety of just getting by. Later years he had plenty. Book sales, movie money, royalties. But he kept writing like he was broke, kept identifying with the losers, the strugglers, the people who couldn't catch a break. Some critics said he was slumming, playing at poverty while living comfortably. Maybe. But the memories were real. The scars were real. The years of actual suffering shaped everything. You don't forget that. Don't stop identifying with it just because your bank account improved. He stayed in San Pedro, didn't move to some exclusive neighbourhood, didn't join the literary elite, didn't start hanging out with famous writers, kept his distance, kept his routine, kept being himself. That consistency mattered, proved it wasn't just rebellion, wasn't just performance. This was actually who he was. Linda gave him stability without demanding conformity. Let him be himself. Let him write. Let him drink, though less than before. Let him go to the track. Didn't try to fix him. Didn't try to save him. Their marriage worked because it was honest. No illusions. No pretending. She knew exactly who she was getting. He knew she wouldn't change him. That mutual understanding created space for actual intimacy, for actual partnership. Something his earlier relationships never achieved. Marina stayed connected, visited regularly, brought her family. Bukowski was a grandfather, played with his grandkids, wrote about them sometimes. Softer poems, gentler observations. The tough guy facade cracked around children, around family, around people who knew him beyond the persona. The persona was real and not real. He was actually that way, actually rough, actually crude. But he was also capable of tenderness, of consideration, of kindness. The persona emphasized certain aspects, minimized others, created a simplified version of a complicated person. That's what we do with artists. Simplify them. Make them symbols. Bukowski the drunk, Bukowski the rebel, Bukowski the misogynist, all true, none complete. The actual person was more complex, more contradictory, more human than the legend. His productivity never really stopped, even at the end, even dying. The compulsion to write remained stronger than everything else, stronger than fear, stronger than pain, stronger than the knowledge that time was running out. He wrote a poem called Bluebird, about having something soft inside, something vulnerable, something he had to hide, had to protect, because showing it would destroy it. The world doesn't handle softness well, doesn't protect vulnerability, crushes it if given the chance, so you hide it, keep it secret, let it exist only in private moments, in poems written late at night, in thoughts nobody else hears. That bluebird was always there, under the tough exterior, under the drinking, under the cruelty. Something tender, something that hurt, something that wanted beauty, wanted connection, wanted love. He spent his life protecting it, hiding it, pretending it didn't exist, but it was there, in the poems, in the moments of honesty, in the admissions nobody expected. His death certificate listed the cause as leukemia, but really it was living, 73 years of it, hard living, the kind that wears you down, the drinking, the cigarettes, the stress, The years of poverty, the years of night shifts, the accumulated damage of a difficult life. It catches up eventually. Always does. Linda handled everything after. The funeral, the estate, the legacy. She protected his work, made sure it stayed in print, made sure it reached new readers, became the guardian of his reputation, not sanitizing it, not hiding the problems, just making sure the work survived, making sure people could find it. Black Sparrow continued publishing posthumous collections, uncollected poems, previously unpublished work, letters, essays, everything. The archive was vast. He'd written constantly for 50 years, left mountains of material, some of it great, some of it rough, all of it honest. Publishers kept finding more, kept releasing new collections. The catalogue expanded after death, kept expanding. Decades later, there are still new books appearing, new compilations, new selections. The work keeps circulating, keeps finding audiences. His influence shows up in unexpected places, in music lyrics, in film dialogue, in other writers' styles, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes not. The directness, the refusal to romanticize, the focus on ordinary suffering. These became tools other artists used, part of the available vocabulary. Literary criticism struggled with him. Still does. He doesn't fit established categories, isn't quite beat poetry, isn't quite confessional, isn't quite anything. Created his own space, his own tradition. Makes him hard to teach, hard to contextualize, hard to place in the official narrative of American literature. But readers don't care about categories. They care whether the work speaks to them, whether it captures something true, whether it helps them understand their own experience. By that measure, Bukowski succeeds, keeps succeeding, keeps reaching people who need exactly what he's offering. He never wanted to be respectable, never wanted academic approval, never wanted to be taught in classrooms. Would have hated that, would have mocked it, would have written a poem about how they turned him into exactly what he'd spent his life opposing. The sanitized, the acceptable, the safe. But you can't control your legacy, can't determine how you'll be remembered, can't prevent people from using your work in ways you'd hate. It happens anyway. The work escapes, it takes on its own life, means different things to different people in different contexts. Some read him as political, anti-capitalist, critical of American society. Others read him as apolitical, just describing personal experience without larger commentary. Both readings find support in the text. He contained multitudes, contradicted himself, refused simple interpretation. The gambling shows up everywhere in his work. The track, the horses, the losing, the occasional win. It's not just subject matter, it's philosophy. Life is gambling. You make your bets. You lose most of the time. You keep playing anyway. Because what else are you going to do? Because sometimes you win. Because the possibility keeps you going. That's as close as he gets to optimism. Not hope exactly, more like stubborn persistence. Refusing to quit. Refusing to give up. Refusing to stop making your bets. Even though the odds are against you. It's not inspiring in the traditional sense, but it's real. It's what people actually do. His relationship with classical music seems incongruous. The tough guy drunk who loves Mahler, who listens to Brahms, who finds comfort in Shostakovich. But it fits. The music gave him access to emotion he couldn't express otherwise, gave him beauty in controlled form, gave him transcendence without requiring belief. The cats were similar. Softness he could permit himself. Beings he could care for without the complications of human relationships. They didn't judge, didn't demand, didn't require performance, just existed. Let him exist. Simple companionship that asked nothing impossible. His face became iconic. The photographs everyone knows, scarred, weathered, looking like he'd lived exactly the life he'd lived. No airbrushing, no flattering angles, just the face, the damage, the years, everything visible, everything acknowledged. He wouldn't have wanted a neat ending, wouldn't have wanted everything tied up, wouldn't have wanted final wisdom or last words that explained everything. Life doesn't work that way, doesn't resolve cleanly, doesn't provide closure, just stops. The work remains. That's what survives. Not the man, not the legend. The actual words on actual pages, the poems, the novels, the stories, everything he made out of everything he suffered, everything he turned into language, everything he left behind. You can read it now, can find what he found, can recognize what he recognized, can use it however you need to use it. That's what it's for. Not to teach you how to live, just to show you someone else who struggled, someone else who failed, someone else who kept going anyway. That's the gift, not inspiration, not salvation, just recognition. The simple acknowledgement that you're not alone, that someone else has been where you are, felt what you feel, survived what you're surviving, or didn't survive but left a record anyway. Bukowski's record is complete. 73 years, thousands of poems, hundreds of stories, 6 novels, volumes of letters, a life fully documented, fully examined, fully transformed into art. Whatever his failures, he did what he set out to do. He wrote it down, all of it, everything that mattered and everything that didn't, made it permanent, made it available, made it yours. That's the achievement, not the book specifically, not the fame, the simple fact of turning suffering into something transmittable, something other people could access, could understand, could use. He made a map of his own hell and left it lying around for anyone who needed directions. The criticism will always exist, the valid criticism, the way he wrote about women, the violence, the casual cruelty that shows up in the work and the life. You can't defend it, shouldn't try. It's there in the record, part of what he was, part of what he did. But you can hold multiple truths simultaneously. He was cruel, and he was honest, he was misogynistic, and he captured something real about class and work. He damaged people, and he helped people. The contradictions don't cancel out, they coexist. That's what makes him human rather than symbol. The younger writers who cite him as influence often miss this complexity. They grab the drinking, miss the discipline underneath, the daily practice, the decades of work before anyone cared, the revision he did despite claiming not to, the craft hidden inside the apparent carelessness. Because that's the real lesson, not the lifestyle, the work ethic, showing up every day, writing whether you feel like it or not, treating it like a job because it is a job, the only job that mattered, the only thing that made sense. His routine in those final San Pedro years was religious in its consistency. Same time every day, same desk, same typewriter, same process. The ritual created the work. The structure made the freedom possible. People who romanticize his chaos miss the discipline that actually produced the outputs. Linda understood this, knew the writing came first, built their life around that fact, didn't resent it, didn't compete with it, just accepted it as the central organizing principle. That's what let the relationship work. That's what previous relationships lacked. The emphysema got worse through the early 90s. Breathing became labor. He'd cough until his face turned red, spit into tissues, struggle for air, keep typing. The body was failing, but the mind stayed clear. The words kept coming even when the breath didn't. He knew what was happening, knew the leukemia diagnosis was the beginning of the end, knew he had months, not years, wrote about it directly. No metaphors, no poetry about death in the abstract. Just here's what's happening to my body. Here's what it feels like. Here's what I'm thinking. The last poem is dated March 9th, the day he died. 4 lines about rain, about being broke, about having Linda, about that being enough, simple, direct, perfect ending for someone who'd spent 50 years writing about survival and small consolations. He typed it in the morning, died that night. The timing feels almost deliberate, like he waited until the last poem was finished. until the work was complete, then let go. But that's probably projection, probably coincidence. Death doesn't wait for dramatic timing. Linda was with him. He wasn't alone. After all those years writing about loneliness, about isolation, about dying drunk in cheap rooms, he died at home with someone who loved him, someone who knew him, someone who'd stuck around. That matters, changes the story, makes it different from the ending he'd written for himself in his younger work. The funeral was March 14th. Small service, friends and family, no media circus, no public spectacle. They scattered some ashes at Santa Anita, the racetrack, where he'd spent so many afternoons, lost so much money, found so much material. It's what he would have wanted, probably the only part of the funeral he would have approved. The literary world noticed. Obituaries appeared. The New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Guardian. All the papers that had ignored him for decades suddenly acknowledged his existence, called him influential, important, a voice of his generation. The usual posthumous respect they never show living writers who make them uncomfortable. Black Sparrow released a statement. John Martin writing about losing a friend, a collaborator, the writer who'd defined his press, who'd justified its existence, who'd proved you could publish serious literature outside New York, outside the establishment, and succeed. Readers mourned in their own ways, posted poems on bulletin boards, shared favourite passages, told stories about what his work had meant to them, how it had helped them survive, how it had given them permission, how it had made them feel less alone. That's what survives, not the controversy, not the legend. The actual impact on actual people. The teenager who finds post office and realises their shit job isn't unique. The alcoholic who reads the poems and feels seen. The lonely person who discovers they're not the only one. That's the legacy. His daughter Marina became executor of the estate, managed the rights, protected the work, made decisions about publication. It couldn't have been easy, being Charles Bukowski's daughter, living in that shadow, dealing with his complicated legacy. But she handled it with grace, kept the work available, kept it in print. New collections kept appearing. The Pleasures of the Damned in 2008, the big comprehensive poetry volume. Over 450 poems selected from his entire career, selling better than most contemporary poetry, reaching new readers, proving the work's durability. Then more posthumous volumes, Storm for the Living and the Dead, On Cats, themed collections, selected letters, everything in the archive eventually, the complete works taking shape slowly, posthumously, the way it often happens with prolific writers. His reputation shifted over time. The drunk poet became the working-class chronicler. The misogynist became the flawed truth-teller. The crude rebel became the honest observer. Each generation finding different things to value, different things to criticize, different ways to read the same words. Academic interest grew. Dissertations got written. Conferences were held. The work was analyzed, contextualized, placed in traditions, connected to movements. Everything he would have hated, everything he'd mocked in his lifetime. Happening anyway, because that's what happens to writers who matter. They get claimed, get studied, get turned into the very thing they opposed. But the work resists complete academic capture. Too raw, too direct, too rooted in actual experience rather than literary tradition. You can analyze it, but something escapes analysis. The voice, the immediacy, the sense of a real person speaking. That can't be reduced to theory, can't be fully explained. His influence on contemporary poetry is undeniable. The conversational tone, the use of everyday language, the focus on ordinary experience, the rejection of academic obscurity. These are common now, standard approaches, but they weren't when he started. He made them possible, made them acceptable. Musicians still cite him. Tom Waits built an entire aesthetic partly from Bukowski's worldview: the bars, the losers, the desperate beauty in degradation. Nick Cave found permission in his honesty, his willingness to be ugly, to show damage. Modest Mouse named a song after him, referenced his work. Countless others absorbed his influence indirectly. Film kept returning to his material. Factotum got adapted in 2005. Matt Dillon as Chinaski, Lily Taylor as Jan. A quieter film than Barfly, more contemplative, less interested in the spectacle of drinking, more interested in the grinding reality of trying to survive while maintaining integrity. The house in San Pedro became a landmark, not officially, just in readers' minds. The place where he wrote, where he lived with Linda, where he died. People still drive by, take pictures, try to feel connected to the work by being near where it was made. He would have hated that, would have yelled at them. But he's dead. Can't yell anymore. Linda lived there for years after, maintained the house, kept his writing room intact, preserved the space where the work happened. Eventually she moved, the house sold, new owners who probably don't know its history, don't care. It's just a house now, like it was before, like it always was. The cats are all dead now, obviously. The ones he wrote about, the ones he loved. Time takes everything, even the small comforts, even the simple pleasures. That's what the late poems understood, what they documented, the slow erosion, the gradual loss, the way things disappear and you keep going anyway. His writing desk sits in a library now, or a museum, preserved, protected, behind glass probably, the actual physical object where he typed those thousands of poems. Those 6 novels, all those words, it's an artifact now, evidence that he existed, that he worked, that he made something. But the desk doesn't matter. The typewriter doesn't matter. The physical objects are just objects. What matters is the words, the poems, the stories, the novels, everything he transformed experience into, everything he left behind when the body failed. You can read it now, right now, any of it, all of it. Pick up Post Office and spend a few hours in his world. Read Love is a Dog from Hell and find poems that cut, find poems that make you laugh, find poems that do both simultaneously. That's what he left, that's what remains. The work doesn't need defending, doesn't need explanation. Either it speaks to you or it doesn't. Either you recognize something true in it or you don't. Either it helps you survive or it doesn't. That's all that matters. Not critical consensus, not academic approval, not his place in the canon, just whether the words work, whether they do what they're supposed to do. What are they supposed to do? Show you someone else who struggled, someone else who failed, someone else who kept going, not as inspiration, as company, as proof that you're not alone in finding life difficult, in finding work soul-crushing, in finding relationships impossible, in finding survival itself an accomplishment. He didn't save anyone, didn't solve anything, didn't make life easier, just showed you someone else making it through, someone else documenting the damage, someone else refusing to quit. That's enough. That's everything.